Hello and welcome to Access Asia. I'm Chape Grand. Coming up in the show, outrage in Singapore over the case of two Malaysian men sentenced to death. One of them was hanged while the other managed to obtain a reprieve. We'll speak to journalist and activist Kirsten Han. And a look at the trials and tribulations of business owners in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan having to handle international sanctions and new restrictions on daily life. And the Mekong River Delta sinking into itself because of excessive sand dredging. Wildlife and livelihoods in and around one of the world's longest rivers are at stake. Starting in the island nation of Singapore, where the fate of two Malaysian men on death row has sparked local mobilization and attracted international attention. On April 25th, Nagaenthran Dharmalingam, 34 years old, was hanged. His crime? Trafficking the equivalent of 3 tablespoons of heroin into the country over a decade ago. With an IQ of 69, which is recognized as a disability, his execution could amount to a breach of international law. And the next day, 36-year-old Datchinamurthy Kataiah won a last-minute reprieve from Singapore's top court, thereby suspending his execution planned for the next day. He was convicted of trafficking a similar amount of heroin into Singapore than Nagaenthran did. Well, Kirsten Han, a journalist and anti-death penalty activist, has been following the fate of these two men very closely for Singaporean newsletter We the Citizens and other media outlets. She joins us on the line from Kuala Lumpur. Kirsten, thank you very much for joining us right here on France 24. First off, you were at the funeral of Nagaenthran Dharmalingam in Malaysia just a few days ago. You spoke with his family, his friends. Can you give us a sense of what that was like?
I think it was really heartbreaking. You go to the funeral that was being held in his family home, and you see the people who were around him when he was growing up, and the people who really loved him and cared about him. So he has a large extended family that's very close knit, and then there's that community that's around them because the family has been living in that same home for decades now. So these are all people who knew him for a long time as a child growing up. And, for them, he was arrested for something that he did when he was about 20, 21 years old, and then just couldn't come home. And to have him finally be able to come home, but in this way, was just really heartbreaking to see. There was a lot of grief and a lot of mourning.
All right, let's take a little step back here to try and understand the situation. Singapore has been famously described in the past as, quote, Disneyland with the death penalty. So sort of a pristine place with a good quality of life, but with this extremely strict regime that's especially harsh on drug offenses. What would you say is behind Singapore's frequent use of the death sentence?
There's this very misguided belief that it deters drug offenses and therefore keeps Singaporeans safe from drugs and drug use. So that's the common narrative that the government will continually spout in the mainstream press and in public outreach campaigns and in speeches. They'll say that this is actually what keeps us safe. And so that kind of conditions Singaporeans to be very pro-death penalty for drugs, even for cases like Nagin, where it's just 3 tablespoons. It just creates a lot of public support for this very, very brutal punishment for what's essentially a non-violent offense.
Well, you talk about public support, but actually the cases of these two young men has gotten a lot of attention from some Singaporeans and internationally as well. Can you tell us what's behind this mobilization, and is this something new or a bit different for a place like Singapore with restrictions on free expression and where citizens typically don't speak up very often?
Yeah, I think it is something new and a sign that something has shifted. With Nagin's case, the support that we received for him from Singaporeans was really quite unprecedented. We had 2 anti-death penalty protests in Singapore in the month of April. And, despite having been involved in anti-death penalty campaigning for over a decade, I was actually surprised by the turnout. So many more people came than I had expected. And it really seemed like Nagin's story in particular really resonated with a lot of people and led a lot of people to not just talk about pity for him, but to actually talk about the death penalty as a regime, as a system, and how it needs to go. That's a really significant shift from previous cases where the conversation might revolve around how sympathetic that individual's story is. Whereas this time, with the protests and with what we've seen among Singaporeans who've been very supportive, it's a bigger conversation about what the death penalty is, who it affects, who's disproportionately affected, who's disproportionately on death row, and actual demands for the death penalty to be completely abolished.
Kirsten Han is a freelance journalist and anti-death penalty activist. Thank you so much for being with us right here on Access Asia.
Thank you.
To Afghanistan now, where we check in on the country's economy since the Taliban took over last summer. Of the 5,000 factories in the country, 2,000 have since shut down. In addition, the banking system's collapsed and the purchasing power of Afghans has plummeted, further deteriorating an already struggling economy. Well, our reporters Shazib Wala and Sonia Ghazali went to Kabul and met the business owners who are struggling to survive under the new regime.
Fahad Shafi's flourishing saffron export business shut down 7 months ago. Started in 2019, his company could not survive the Taliban takeover.
We're like cleaning the saffron in here and drying it in here. And this was the office. We were buying these saffrons from the farmers in Herat and then sending it to USA.
The international sanctions imposed on the country had taken a heavy toll on his business.
When Taliban came in Kabul, so everything is stopped. There's no DHL, there's no FedEx. So right now we cannot send anything from Afghanistan to outside. And the saffron which we are selling in USA, my partners cannot send the money also in Afghanistan. You cannot take out the monies from the banks.
In Kabul, more than 1,000 private businesses closed down since the Taliban took over. Yet a few survived, as is the case for this social enterprise. It manufactures reusable sanitary napkins. But with the orders declining, employees are now paid only 5,000 Afghanis, or about 54 euros a month.
When the Taliban took over, we were closed for 2 months. Then we reopened, but we import our raw material from India and direct deliveries have stopped. So everything goes through Dubai and then comes here. That means it costs more and takes longer to get delivered. The other difficulty is that the prices of everything have increased in Afghanistan.
This karaoke restaurant in the center of the city has never reopened since the Taliban arrived in Kabul.
Before, young people used to come here. They used to laugh. They used to have karaoke nights. There were concerts. It was very popular. But it's closed now. The Islamic Emirate has banned it.
Noor Muhammad is a barber. He's using his savings to make ends meet.
I lost 60% of my business. With the Islamic Emirate, most of the men don't touch their beards. Some are still coming, but just to get a haircut.
According to the World Bank, the Afghan economy will further contract in the coming year.
It's one of the longest rivers in the world, and it's also at the heart of an environmental crisis. The Mekong, which begins in China and crosses through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, is being dredged for sand with devastating effects on the local economy and wildlife. A UN report last week showed that sand extraction for the construction industry was causing the Mekong Delta to sink and was leading to salinization of what used to be fertile lands. Well, our colleagues from France 2 sent us this report, translated and voiced in English by Wassim Cornet.
It's Asia's nourishing river. Some 70 million people depend on the Mekong River for fishing or rice fields. But today the majestic Mekong is under attack. In Cambodia, dredgers pump tens of thousands of tons of sand every day, and it's having a devastating effect on the river's ecosystem. A dozen environmental activists protested against the practice. They were jailed. The financial stakes are enormous. Sand from the Mekong River is used in gigantic real estate ventures worth billions of euros. Phnom Penh is in the midst of a major housing boom, and this is how the Mekong sand is used to build these massive artificial lands on the river itself. But it's not just the river's ecosystem. Construction is threatening some of the Cambodian capital's oldest neighborhoods.
We know that they will be eventually need to move. And they don't want to move, of course, because they've been here for decades.
This NGO director is one of the only people who these residents can rely on to fight for their homes.
We used to live here surrounded by nature. We would capture fish and then sell them. We used to grow vegetables too. That lifestyle's gone because the big companies filled up the lakes.
But there's more that will affect the Mekong's future. These massive upstream dams built in China and Laos. The concrete barriers have already changed the river's wildlife, leading to a domino effect all along the river. The dams have made the number of fish dwindle. This man fished in the Mekong for 40 years, but he and all of the fishermen here have now given up and switched to collecting shellfish.
Before the dams, the level of the river was a lot higher, and then it began to drop. These shellfish sell for about 4 to 6 euros per day. Back when we fished, I could make up to 14 euros a day.
For many experts, the non-stop dredging and building means the Mekong is being sacrificed in favor of economic development.
And if you're not too scared of heights, let's now take a look at what could be the world's longest glass-bottomed bridge. The Bac Long pedestrian bridge in Vietnam is suspended above a lush jungle, snakes around cliff faces, and also spans over a valley between two peaks for a total length of 632 meters. Guinness World Records is expected to confirm this claim later this month. Perhaps more importantly, this is part of Vietnam's bid to lure international tourists back to the country after 2 years of COVID shutdowns, which kept travelers away. Well, that's it for this show. Do stay tuned to France 24 and see you next week on Access Asia.